And the marketing mindset, I would argue that the majority of really successful businesses often owe their disproportionate success, although we usually attribute it to an innovation. Quite likely, it's actually they've stumbled on a psychological factor which all their competitors have ignored.
Welcome to Thought Sparks. Like, subscribe, comment, share, and enjoy.
Hey everybody, Rita McGrath here with another edition of our Thought Sparks podcast. And I am super delighted this week that my guest is Rory Sutherland, who is with Ogilvy Mather, and he's had a very long and distinguished career. He's an advertising legend, and we're going to hear something about his life and opinions and where advertisements come. And given the turbulent nature of how advertising has changed, I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating. So welcome, Rory.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
What an idea. So perhaps for our listeners who might not be familiar with your journey, how did you get into advertising? What did you find so interesting about it?
Well, I'll be absolutely honest with you. I left university. I was a classics graduate, bizarrely. And I suppose it was in that little Venn diagram between where the overlap of quite interesting and reasonably remunerative, which isn't all that big an overlap in many cases. And so I applied to a whole range of agencies in what was then the graduate recruitment program. Mm-hmm. And by a very, very happy accident, only one of them offered me a job. I had a few second interviews. Only one of them offered me a job, which was the direct marketing arm. It was then called Ogilvy Mather Direct, now Ogilvy One. It was the direct marketing arm of Ogilvy. And back then, of course, pre-internet, there were not, you would either do off-the-page advertising, sometimes direct response television or radio advertising, direct mail, or sometimes telemarketing. Mm-hmm. Those were the addressable media, if you like, at the time. Database marketing, you might call it. Mm-hmm. And, of course, if you think about it, they're all, in a way, rather similar to academic experiments, the A/B test, the randomized control trial. Funnily enough, I ought to take credit for this, that with a couple of exceptions, the advertising industry had mastered the randomized control trial and the A/B test about 60 years before medicine cottoned on.
Oh, interesting.
So in the Edwardian era, you had this very peculiar thing that newspapers were produced quite often on 2 printing presses, or 4.
I didn't know that.
And what happened? Now, I've never known whether this was something that happened anyway or whether it happened at the behest of advertisers. The 2 newspapers would come off 2 parallel printing machines and then they'd be interleaved, a bit like shuffling a pack of cards. Huh. So a newspaper from printing press A would then be next to one from B, would then be next to one from A. Now, what this meant was that you could run separate advertisements on the 2 presses. On the coupon, you would then have a code, and the advertiser could measure which of the 2 creative executions on the 2 headlines brought in more responses. Huh. And of course, why it was important that the things were interleaved was that effectively every single newsagent would receive an equal number of each advertisement, so it was properly randomized. It wouldn't have worked if, all the rich areas got ad A and all the poorer parts of town got ad B. Because they were interleaved, it was effectively beautifully randomized. And the ad industry was doing this, back in the Edwardian era, or possibly the Victorian era. And medicine, of course, was weirdly late. Partly they had more ethical concerns than we did. I mean, the advertising equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath is don't get found out. But
I love that.
But obviously there are ethical concerns with A/B testing in medicine, which we didn't have to worry about. There was an interesting little detail, however, which is you were allowed to test creative executions. Sometimes it'd be exactly the same visual, different headline. Sometimes it'd be a completely different ad altogether. The one thing that you weren't allowed to test was price. And the reason was, at least at the time, I don't think modern digital platform owners have the same ethical sense. The newspaper owners thought it was unfair for some of their readers to be offered a better deal than others. And so the one thing you couldn't perfectly test in that old print era was price. But anything creative you could test, and there are these wonderful books like Scientific Advertising by Claude Hopkins, which shows that, mail order advertising, direct response advertising was to some extent pretty sophisticated in its use of statistics and measurement. But also, of course, the randomized control trial is, as all academics know, it's kind of the gold standard for proof. And so I absolutely love this because my A-levels, what you studied in the last 2 years at school, were Latin, Greek, and maths.
Oh, my.
My brother was a very good mathematician. He was actually on the UK Maths Olympiad team in the early 80s, which is like the world's biggest nerd competition.
The
only annoying thing about growing up with someone who was very good at maths is I assumed I was kind of rubbish. And actually, I subsequently learned that I'm actually okay. And one of the interesting things is that combination of kind of creativity and maths and science and experimentation fundamentally played just to my strengths. But also I arrived at this agency, which was a little bit of a peculiar anomaly because it was part of an enormous international advertising group. David Ogilvy himself was a massive advocate of direct marketing.
When you joined?
I only met him once. I knew his widow subsequently quite well. I only met him once. He died in 1999. But he was a huge direct response advocate. In fact, he based his office in Paris in the direct response agency, not in the advertising agency. And he was exactly, I think, he was one of the people who got the balance of artistry, creativity, and science. I think that was his real contribution. He got the balance of the two right. There were people who wanted a very reductionist view of advertising, and David actually realized that there was that creativity in service of an end, actually, apart from anything else, of course, measurement in many ways and testing allows you to experiment much more. And it allows you to fail. It allows you to take measurable, manageable risks. So what was lovely about this, to use a Jeff Bezosism, is that, small tests were like a two-way door. You could develop a hypothesis, proper science, develop a hypothesis, devise a test to actually validate or invalidate your hypothesis, run and go. What I then discovered is, this was, to me, the gateway drug for behavioral science. So much later on, I ended up becoming president of the IPA, which is it's the 4As in Britain, the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising. And for my 2-year presidency, I made understanding what were, I think, the recently, I suppose, becoming well-known and famous advances of Kahneman, Tversky, and Co., much better known within the advertising industry, which was wonderful because I was just early enough that you could invite Daniel Kahneman over to give a talk and so forth before these people subsequently became rock stars. And then when I went back into Ogilvy, I founded a behavioral science practice. But the whole interest in that had been occasioned by effectively the discovery that there are wonderful butterfly effects in marketing. I'll give you a lovely example of this going back historically. There was a company that probably made a few $1 million a year for about 20 years. And they'd originally run an advertisement which was selling a correspondence course on grammatical writing. And the original headline was, "Do you make mistakes in English?" And it wasn't very successful. They added 2 words. Do you make these common mistakes in English? Suddenly, they'd stumbled on a fortune. And the reason was these made the person read on because they were curious. They wanted to know, what are these mistakes I might be making? But the beautiful thing was the word common also, in a sense, destigmatized them. Because if lots of people are making this mistake, it means that I might be making these mistakes. I'm not an idiot. Most people make the mistake, but I can now avoid it. And so you discovered time and time again in direct marketing that these seemingly what you might call trivial changes would have, I suppose the thing is the laws of psychology are fundamentally different to the laws of physics. In other words, small interventions can have monumental effects. Right. And so I've always effectively spent the rest of my life trying, I think, sometimes more successfully than at other times, to meld that kind of scientific inquiry that comes from academia and from some very interesting behavioral science experiments with the actual practice of marketing. The main reason for this, I think, is we need very, very badly in modern organizations to elevate marketing from being a discipline to being a way of thinking. The unfortunate thing that happened to marketing is it became a department. It lost responsibility for sort of price and product and became confined to promotion, one of the 4 Ps, which is, of course, the part which is the cost. And my argument is that marketers make a terrible mistake because they justify their existence on the basis of what they do, not on the basis of how they think. And the marketing mindset, I would argue that the majority of really successful businesses often owe their disproportionate success, although we usually attribute it to an innovation. Quite likely, it's actually they've stumbled on a psychological factor which all their competitors have ignored. And I think the importance of this, my example is Uber doesn't really change that much about riding in a taxi. What it changes completely is the psychological experience of waiting for a taxi. Because the map reduces, and paying for one, by the way, as well. The map massively reduces that uncertainty. How much is it going to cost? How long? How far away is it? All of those questions are answered, within seconds of you booking the car. Yeah. And so consequently, I think that actually an extraordinary number of innovations, really, really important innovations, which we okay, I'll put it bluntly. Edison was a marketer every bit as much as he was an inventor.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, there's
Jobs was a marketer. Yeah.
Really.
He couldn't code. Okay, let's be honest about this. Okay, he couldn't code what he had.
It was Wozniak that did the coding.
Wozniak did. By the way, I absolutely revere Wozniak, so I'm not for 1 second diminishing any credit there. But Jobs' own strength was marketing.
Absolutely.
Rolls of Rolls-Royce. Royce was the engineer. Rolls was the salesman. And so one of the things I think we need to understand is that that marketing and innovation are actually handmaidens. That they work best in combination, because any innovation requires people to do 2 things they really don't like doing, which is do something they haven't done before and do something which most people aren't doing.
Right.
And our default modes as humans are habit and social copy.
Absolutely.
And so the psychological component to innovation, both internally within organizations and externally with customers, fundamentally, it requires a lot of psychological work to get people to override their internal default mode.
Absolutely. Well, and I think marketing also can be, without the marketing piece, a lot of innovations are really badly misunderstood.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Right? So people invent the thing and they don't actually know what it is. And it often takes somebody with a marketing mindset to say, well, no, here's how it fits to what customers need and here's how it fits to a particular customer journey. And this is what it really is. And I find it very interesting.
It's an act of translation, isn't it? It effectively translates a bundle of features into some sort of narrative which is acceptable and comprehensible and appealing. And you can produce the best invention in the world, but if you market it badly, you're doomed.
Wasn't it Peter Drucker that said the only real functions of a corporation is marketing and innovation?
Marketing and innovation. Everything else is a cost.
Everything else is a cost. That's right.
What's fascinating about that, by the way, is that Drucker was Austrian. Drucker's dad was an economist. And by which I mean, obviously by definition, an Austrian economist. Okay. The Austrian school of economics has a fundamentally different respect for psychology and perceived value to the mainstream Chicago school. So neoliberal economics basically assumes that people have stable preferences. They understand, they know already what they want and know exactly to the penny how much they're prepared to pay for a given unit of utility. And therefore the only job of a business is to provide people with what they know they want at as low a price as possible. None of which, by the way, works empirically, because how on earth do you have the Swiss watch industry? Okay, if that's really how the world works, okay, right?
Right. Well, you've done some studies of watches, as I understand it.
No, it just intrigues me, because I always say there are certain categories of business, like luxury watches and cruise lines, which are a bit like the Galapagos Islands of human behaviour. You know, the most bizarre thing, if you look at the watch industry, is that people will set a £9,000 Rolex by looking at a £100 Seiko watch. For a more accurate guide to the time. Okay. It's very, very... It's partly driven by the fact, of course, that men generally aren't allowed to wear jewellery. So it occupies a very, very unusual space. But it's also completely bizarre, because it's dominated by pilots' watches for people who can't fly, and divers' watches for people who aren't PADI qualified. So, it fascinates me for all kinds of reasons.
It is interesting.
In fairness, it also has, in a sense, two customer bases, which are effectively status seekers and watch nerds. And it's quite interesting, because the watch nerds, in a way, keep the watch companies honest. It'd be very easy to sell a £9,000 watch to 90% of the populace with a £20 movement.
Right.
You can't take that risk, because the watch nerds will call you out, and you'll lose all your status. So it's quite interesting, because I think the car industry is the same. I think a lot of brands are actually kept honest by maybe 5 to 10% of their customer base, who are the people who really know. But particularly in a social media world, you can't afford... Now, sometimes I think those people do you a disservice. It's very interesting. So if you look at Jaguar or Ferrari, both of them have introduced electric cars, which have to some extent scandalized their core loyal following.
Base, right.
In the same way, as I said, that Bob Dylan scandalized his folky following when he went electric, in the same way. Sometimes I'd argue, as a business or a brand, you have to take that risk, that you can't be completely in thrall to your most fanatical user base, because it might prevent you from innovating. But it interests me, because it always strikes me that there's something important that we don't... A very good friend of mine called Don Marty, who's a brilliant writer on digital advertising, makes the point that there is a believability, a credibility, a sense of conviction to an ad displayed in public, which isn't the same as an ad delivered in private. Because an ad displayed in public, will be seen by people more expert than you. And it's why I always say you make your marriage vows in church in front of everybody you know. You don't do it door to door. And, when that person says, if anybody has any just cause or impediment, you know that probably if there were someone who knew you had a secret family 15 miles away, there might be someone present who'd know and call you out, even if you don't know yourself. And so I think there's some fascinating aspects to advertising which the digital enthusiasts have overlooked, which is that the validity of a promise made publicly is fundamentally different in terms of its level of conviction.
Oh, that's so interesting.
To a promise made privately.
The other thing that I think comes into it is, what's your product really competing with?
I know.
And this, I think, is fascinating. So in strategy, which is sort of my intellectual home, strategy and innovation, or where I come from, and I constantly have to tell executives or sort of encourage them to say, you can't just think of the thing that could be a functional substitute for what you're doing as your main competition. And one of the most interesting historical examples I've ever seen of this is the Zippo lighters. Remember those?
Yes. Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, right? Well...
wonderful advertising, actually, as well.
Very good advertising.
Recovered from shark stomachs and so forth.
Yeah, all that kind of...
And I think they had the claim that they'd repair one. If it broke, you could send it back and they'd repair it for free. Yeah.
And they have all different ones, right? And so, I would play this trick on my MBA students when I was still teaching in the MBAs, and I'd like, give me the competitor set for the Zippo lighter, right?
And they go Calibri and, of course.
Bic even,
matches. If they're a bit more
all
imaginative, they say matches. Yeah.
One actually
free
did...
matchbooks in bars. Yeah.
One actually came back and said, "Oh, magnifying glasses." I said, "What?" He said, "Oh, you get out in the sunshine, you make a little pile of twigs and leave it." And of course, they're all thinking of the
Yes,
functional.
Notionally, functionally, rubbing two sticks together
Right,
is indeed a competitor too. Yeah.
And so then I kind of pushed them, and I said, "Well, what would you say if I told you that for decades the people at that company thought of their main competition as gifts, as men's wallets?"
Of course.
And the students are all like, "What do you mean?
What are you talking about?
What am I talking about?" I said, "Look, women of a certain age have a problem. The men that they have been with, if they've been with them for any length of time, have these events that come up, birthdays and anniversaries and holidays. And there's a significant proportion of men that are kind of very difficult to buy presents for."
Yes.
Now, Zippo had the genius, right?
There's a weird male thing, I think, which makes them difficult to buy presents for, which is that men are very happy with luxuries, but they have to have some notional function.
Right.
There's no scented candle for men, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So the fun
Except under very unusual
yes, but it has to have some notional. By the way, interestingly, the Swiss watch industry arose partly because of Swiss Calvinism, which is Calvinists massively disapproved of jewelry. So Swiss jewelers had to invent themselves as luxury watchmakers because the watch, because it notionally has a function. Now, nearly every complication on a watch can be better performed by a mobile phone. If you want moon phases, there's a free app you can download. It really isn't necessary. But the watch does have some sort of mechanical function or utility.
Yep.
And so men are more difficult in that respect because you can't buy them, as I said, the sort of scented candles stuff.
Right. Well, anyway, so the
Yeah.
Zippo people had the genius to make all these special edition Zippos. So you can get Star Trek ones, you can get branded ones, you can get football team ones. And so if I can get my guy collecting Zippos, even if he's not using them for anything involving lighting a fire, if I can get him collecting them, my gift problems are solved forever.
Saved Lego to some extent, didn't it? Exactly that same approach, which is going after understanding the role your product plays in a completely new or refreshing way.
Right.
It's absolutely. I mean, I find this absolutely fascinating because. There are all those wonderful quotes, in the, what was it? In the factory, we make quarter-inch drill bits. To the customer, we're selling quarter-inch holes.
Exactly.
But there was a wonderful discussion about that, which I love. I mean, I love these discussions. It was at J. Walter Thompson, and one of the people involved was a copywriter called, I think, Llewellyn Thomas, who was the son of the poet Dylan Thomas.
Oh.
And the argument was precisely about Black & Decker drills. And the argument was, and I think both sides of the argument are true. Do you perceive a need to make a quarter-inch hole and go out and buy a drill? Or do you, do you see a drill and go, that looks really cool, you buy it, and then go home and find an excuse to make quarter-inch holes in order to use your drill?
I think there's probably both.
They're probably both. It's fascinating.
Both.
Yeah.
It really is.
I had one of the things I love doing is finding really eminent academics and having conversations with them about things which are seemingly very trivial. And so two little suggestions I made with Nassim Taleb is that the real value of a dishwasher isn't that it cleans your plates and cutlery, it's that it keeps dirty plates out of sight.
I could see that.
The biggest annoyance when your dishwasher breaks down isn't that you have to wash the plates, it's that you have to look at them. But the other one, which he's actually followed my advice and bought a house with a swimming pool, the real value of a swimming pool isn't that you swim in it, it's that it gives you a license to walk around your garden in a bathing costume without feeling like an idiot. Okay. If you don't have a pool, right, you can't walk around in bathing trunks on a hot day because it just feels absurd. The second you have a pool, you have complete liberty to wear what the hell you like, even if you never go in the pool.
Right.
And so understanding these kind of things, I find absolutely fascinating.
Well, and how different customer segments respond to exactly the same thing in completely different ways.
And also, of course, it's essential to innovation because effectively most people are willing to make most innovations involve some degree of a trade-off.
Of course.
Okay. In the case of electric cars, I find it hysterical because the trade-off is range and charging time. Simply because of the law of physics, on nearly every other dimension, electric cars are simply better cars. But people become absolutely fixated on the negative. If you're clear about the negative in advance, and you say, this is basically the deal, you get much better X, Y, and Z in return for a slightly worse A, when the people then experience it, they're generally happy because you've effectively managed their expectations.
Right.
If the thing comes as a surprise, completely. So I'm a huge fan. I'm a user, even when I'm traveling on expenses where I could stay in a more expensive hotel. If I'm only staying for 1 or 2 nights, I'll gravitate to the Citizen M or the Moxie. Because it's a trade-off that works for me, which is the communal spaces are better. Apart from anything else, by the way, this is something which they never say. It's very similar to that swimming pool argument. Let's say you've got to check out of your room at 11, because a lot of hotel rooms you do. Okay? At a lot of hotels, you're sort of rendered homeless because you could sit there with a laptop in the dining room, but you'd feel a bit of a prat. Okay, the Moxie or the Citizen M, the ground floor is a bit like a WeWork. Okay, there's a barista, there's a bar, there are little meeting rooms you can book, there are little nooks and corners where you can sit. The great thing about the Moxie is if your train leaves or your flight leaves at 9 o'clock in the evening, but you've got to vacate your room at 11, there are even lockers there. Okay,
very nice.
So you basically get an extra 8 hours of hotel stay for free at a Citizen M or not your room, but you've got the toilets, you've got you've got everything else you need, and you can make yourself at home in a way you can't in a posher hotel.
And you'd be working the same way you would if you were.
Exactly. No. And the interesting thing is, it's very interesting because it's the customer satisfaction at those hotels, which are innovative hotels in a way, are all about understanding the trade-off in advance. And speaking to people who work there, they said, you get 3 kinds of customers. They're people who have stayed there before, they understand the deal, and it's something they prefer. You wouldn't stay in one for a week, okay? But for a 2-night, 1-night stay, absolutely perfect. Small room, no room service, no laundry service, but the ground floor's 24 hours, barista coffee. And the people who have stayed there before buy into the thing. The people who understand the trade-off in advance turn up and are really, really happy. Then there's a 10% of people who are expecting the Marriott or the Hilton who are kind of livid because they go, what do you mean there's no room service? Why is my room so small? So part of marketing is essential. I think marketing is often essential to innovation because it's making explicit what the trade-off is. Once you're actually prepared for that, you're a happy punter.
Absolutely.
If it comes to you unexpectedly, completely different matter.
Absolutely.
But I mean, the other interesting thing to me is that, I mean, going back to that Austrian school of economics, the Austrian school would believe that marketing is as much a form of value creation as manufacturing because their only conception of value was subjective. They have an ordinal, not a let me get this right. They have an ordinal, not a cardinal utility function. They believe you either prefer A to B. They don't believe that there's a sort of you prefer a clock radio 1.37 times more than you prefer a coffee machine.
Right.
Their idea of cost is really opportunity cost. It's a fundamentally different way of looking at business, which is much, much more marketing friendly than the mainstream economic model, which is taught in all business schools. The really fascinating thing about the Austrians is they would argue, Hayek and people like this would say, the purpose of a business is a discovery mechanism.
Yes.
It exists to explore new adjacent forms of value creation, and the purpose of a business is exploration. Now, the mainstream model is the purpose of a business is operational efficiency or cost reduction or something of that kind. But over time, I would argue, a business run on Austrian lines actually generates much more value than a business run on neoliberal lines.
Oh, I think so. If you combine that with the work of the late economist William Baumol,
he wrote cost disease, the
William Baumol and the cost disease. But what I think is super interesting about that, so just for those of you that don't know what that is, what Baumol did was, this is back in the 60s, and he studied, among other things, orchestras. He said, well, in the manufacturing sectors of the economy, you had productivity. Now, I have a lot of questions about how we measure productivity. But he said if you just, it's widgets input to widgets output, and, less input to more outputs is equal product.
And through the division of labor and through effectively repetition, you can gain productivity. I mean, Adam Smith was the first.
All the way back to
the
Adam
pin
Smith.
factory. Yeah.
Of course, there's a wonderful book written by a Swedish woman called Who Made Adam Smith's Dinner?
His mum, actually.
His mum and his sister.
His mum, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah,
What did
very
they
fair
get
point.
paid for it? Nothing.
Nothing.
Anyway.
Actually, the majority of value, economic value, is probably non-transactional.
Right.
But of course, because it's not quantified.
Right.
The other interesting thing is this is disproportionately true at the bottom of society and at the top. And at the bottom of society, far more happens through barter because you've got no money.
Right.
So you look after someone's kids on Wednesday and they look after your kids on Friday. None of that appears in the GDP statistics.
Exactly.
Similarly, at the top, you're often trading favors where it's socially unacceptable to attach a price to it.
Oh, yes.
So there are an awful lot of things where if you do this for me, I will mentally remember that you owe me a favor, and I will then ask you to introduce me to someone whom I otherwise can't meet.
Right.
Now, none of that stuff, of course, again, and so there's a very senior investment banker who said, at my level, very little of what I do is transactional. Effectively, you're oiling the wheels for things invisibly.
Yeah, you get to a stage where what you mainly do is have lunch.
And it is exactly, it's a favor bank.
Well, and you've talked about on other occasions about universities as being a place where people that don't have access to those kinds of relationships can actually meet people who do. And that can have a very...
Probably, in private education and in elite higher education, a few very honest, very astute people with very good metacognition will say, I'm actually buying my kids a peer group. I'm not buying them an education. There was an American family who argue, fascinating, because we wouldn't have noticed this as Brits, because, they said the first thing they did was put their child into a very expensive British private school, because they said the contacts you acquire there are more valuable than those you get in an elite Ivy League university, but at a lower cost, ironically. Per year, significantly lower, if you think about it. And so, this is one of the most problematic things, which is that there are various, various people have written about American higher education as a luxury goods business. Right. It just as Rolex artificially limit access to their watches. You're producing a product which would be perfectly possible to mass produce if you're Harvard. But you deliberately make it scarce in order to maintain its scarcity value.
Yeah, well, that's strategy 101, right?
Certainly for luxury goods. Yeah. And it's very interesting because there's a watch brand called Citizen, which has been a Japanese brand, which has been responsible for some of the most interesting innovations in watchmaking, including the solar-powered eco-drive watch, which effectively never needs recharging and so forth. But they seem to have, I think they were founded with a kind of egalitarian viewpoint. So they've never succeeded in actually translating themselves into a luxury brand.
Right.
And historically, Americans were very bad at producing luxury brands because you had a very large market. Your natural inclination was, if this is any good, everybody deserves to have it. So the Americans produced Coca-Cola and the French produced Louis Vuitton. Now, Americans have started to do that. You could argue that, as I think Scott Galloway does, that, the Ivy League is actually
now a luxury product.
Is effectively Louis Vuitton. For the upper middle class. And we have to have ethical concerns with this, I think.
Yeah.
Because you're actually selling something under essentially false pretenses. You're claiming to sell an education when actually you're paying for select access to an elite peer group.
Oh, yeah. I think it's always been that way. So if I ask somebody, for example, so I teach at Columbia, very elite business school. We like to think of ourselves that way. And if I say to them, okay, well, the students, well, tell me the value of attending Columbia and getting an MBA from there. And number one is always the network. Number
Yeah.
two is, well, you're in New York City, so that's fabulous. Number three is, and you just
Yeah,
go
of
down the
course.
list
Yeah,
and you
yeah.
get to item 12 or 13. Oh, you might learn something.
You might, no, absolutely. Yeah. You might learn something.
I get the best internships. I get all this stuff. But I do want to come back to your career for just a minute because, you've been with the same, I've
done lots of different
pieces of this, but similarly of the same company for a long time. And of course, advertising and media more broadly has been just buffeted by these massive waves of change. And I'd be interested in your reflections on how, when your organizations have adapted well and when they've really struggled.
Well, that brings me back quite nicely to the fact that because Ogilvy was a huge devotee of direct marketing, it gave us a few. If you trace the history of Ogilvy, it got lucky with its clients at the right moment. So one of the things was, because we did direct marketing well, we ended up with American Express as a client for many, many years. No longer, unfortunately. I loved working on it. And American Express, as a brand, as a business, is a kind of, I said earlier, if you grow up in a shop, it's like a free MBA. If your parents run a shop or your parents run a restaurant, it's like a free MBA. The great thing about working on American Express is you had everything. You had a fantastic, in a sense, luxury goods brand.
Don't leave home without it.
You had wonderful advertising. You had ingenious behavioral ideas like the member since date on the card, which has probably made them a few $1 billion in terms of client retention.
College students? The special account for college students?
Of course, absolutely right.
I carried an Amex for years because I got that in college.
You got it in college. Member marketing, there's direct marketing, there's a loyalty program, there's a bit of everything. As a place to learn, other than Procter & Gamble or something, it's probably pretty much perfect. And so American Express was with Ogilvy because we did both. And it was partly on the basis of American Express and a few other accounts. Then direct marketing also gave you an advantage because you had B2B clients. So one of the great things about it, and then direct marketing was also valuable because we understood digital marketing much faster than conventional ad agencies did.
I bet you would have.
So we saw it as this glorious opportunity, whereas the advertising people tended to see it as a bit of a threat or a bit of a distraction. And so the direct marketing part of Ogilvy was the part around which you could pivot quite successfully into B2B, it was American Express largely, which made Ogilvy fully international. Actually, a few other clients before that, Unilever as well. But effectively, 3 or 4 clients. And then we had IBM in the very early days of the internet. We had IBM, again, because, it's very largely a B2B business, but we were there already. And they were actually a perfect client to have in terms of walking together into the digital future. Now, a lot of conventional ad agencies were overweight on packaged goods. And this, by the way, actually concerns me, which is that creative marketing thinking is of enormous value to businesses of all sizes and businesses of all sectors. Because of the way in which agencies were historically paid by commission, in other words, and also to some extent paid by the hour, we've always been overweight those sectors of the economy which happen to just spend a disproportionate amount of money on media. And the great thing about this direct marketing business was that it rebalanced you. And one of the things, since I wrote my book and since I occasionally give podcasts, and my argument is, don't talk about what marketers do, talk about how they think.
Is this alchemy or?
That's in the book Alchemy, yeah. Effectively what I did was I thought, if you want to actually appeal to a wider audience, there's no point in going to an audience of compliance officers or whatever and talking about making an ad, because they're never going to be asked to make an ad. You can use ads for illustrative purposes, but there's no point going into the weeds of this. Instead, explain the extent to which psychology, and by the way, I think psychological breakthroughs are sometimes intentional, sometimes accidental, but maybe more on that later. But psychological factors are a major determinant of the success or failure of particularly innovative businesses. And consequently, effectively, how marketers think is of value to, for example, small businesses who may be completely unaware of it. They never get access to that same creativity precisely because they just don't spend $17 million a year on media. Mm-hmm. And behavioral science also helped provide a kind of framework for, it was a kind of mental mug tree on which to hang some of the insights that you have about particularly the more counterintuitive forms of human behavior. And the best thing, it happened to me yesterday, the best thing that ever happened to me is that you occasionally get a letter from someone who goes, I run a small haulage company. This is actually what happened yesterday. And I listened to you on a podcast and I bought your book. And actually, it's changed the way we do business.
Wow.
We now spend quite a lot of money on things we previously thought were silly, for example. And this gets back to the point about, symbolism matters.
Oh, yeah.
Symbolic acts really, really matter. We disproportionately weight them in our perception.
In our brains.
In our brains.
One of my favorite examples of this is I was working with a client that literally makes drywall that gets sold to construction companies. And, looked at through one lens, you'd think about the quality of the drywall and the reliability of the supply, and you make sure it doesn't have mold and everything else. Turns out the single biggest determinant of which company got the contract for the drywall purchase was whether they also gave their potential clients NASCAR tickets.
Perfect.
It's a total commodity, right? So, but if I can go watch cars, race very quickly around a thing with all my buddies.
Well, funny enough, by the way, that insight has a bearing, I think, on corporate rewards and remuneration, which is the value of corporate perks in some ways is that they're guilt-free indulgence. Most people could afford to do it with their own money, but you feel a bit guilty or awkward doing it. If, on the other hand, it comes to you as a sideline benefit from something else, then the mental transaction cost is totally reduced.
Changes.
And so, I always joked about this. I said the great thing about company cars was they allowed you to have a better car than you could justify buying with your own money to your own spouse.
Right.
And so one of the things I think corporate austerity I regard as fundamentally misguided. I think it often has actually quite negative effects. And it destroys a lot of the symbolic value of working for a company, which is occasional judicious extravagance at appropriate moments are actually anthropologically necessary to actually form people into teams. And I think I think the finance department has too much of a grip now over, in other words, it has right of veto over more or less everything.
Yeah.
And by the way, this is something which really fascinates me and I'd love to discuss with you, which is the whole question of risk and reward within organizations. Because among the various findings of behavioral science are some things which seem anecdotal at first, and then you realize that they have much, much wider significance. So the reason I first got interested in behavioral science was that early days, direct marketing, we're writing to 50,000 people who are customers of BT, which is rather like AT&T would be in the US. And we're selling them what I think you called star services or network services. Bear in mind, this is pre-mobile phone, for the most, not quite, but more or less. Certainly pre the mass adoption of mobile phones. And you had to pay a monthly subscription of a few pounds if you wanted to have call diversion, call waiting. You'll remember these things.
I remember that.
And three-way calling, I think, was a third product.
Answering. The automatic answer.
That was later. The digital answering service came a bit later. And we used to write letters to people typically who used their telephones more. And we offered them this product for £3 a month. And they could reply in two ways. They could either send back a pre-lasered coupon at the bottom of the letter, or they could phone an 0800 number. Both cases, it was free. And we had a client who, for some bonkers reason, said, we're a phone company. Why are we allowing people to reply by post? We should be trying to promulgate greater use of the telephone. And we quite rightly said, that's fine, but let's test it. And so 50,000 letters went out to a randomized sample of people. Sorry, 150,000 letters went out. 50,000 of them only allowed people to respond by phone. 50,000 of them only allowed people to respond by post.
Wow.
And the remaining 50,000, as before, allowed people to respond by either telephone or post, whichever they chose. The response rates were, and this is to within 0.1 of I suppose 0.1 of a percentage point. Phone only 2% response rate. Post only 4% response rate. If you offered people the choice of two, it was 5.9 to 6%.
Wow.
Practically the sum total of the other two response rates. Now, to an economist, economists aren't blind to transaction costs.
No.
Okay. There's also an idea that Richard Thaler introduced called transaction utility, which is how a particular transaction feels to you. And there's some wonderful thought experiments he's done around that. But what the hell is... Now, what was strange is that only a few of my colleagues went, hold on, there's a Nobel Prize in economics here if we can investigate the true... Why on earth? What it suggests is that the primary determinant to whether you bought this product or not wasn't what the product was or how much it cost. It was how you could respond.
Yeah, isn't that wild?
What? And fun enough, marketers are generally right about this. Everybody else in business is generally wrong. This is why it's important. Marketers know that the more channels through which you sell, the more you sell. Finance people are trying to drive customers through the lowest cost channels.
Right.
And so you have the daft idea of McDonald's, which only have on-screen ordering. Now, don't get me wrong, on-screen ordering has made a fortune for McDonald's. But then someone notices, and that's because it's an option, not an obligation. Then someone notices it's marginally cheaper to serve someone through a screen than it is through having someone standing by a till, taking the order face to face. Therefore, what we want to do is drive all the customers to this lower cost to serve channel. You then claim the credit for the reduction in cost because now you don't need to employ so many people in the McDonald's. You're not held responsible for the corresponding lost drop in sales.
Exactly.
And marketers are mostly right about this, that the more moments at which you sell, the more you sell. There used to be an incredibly boring finding, but actually significant in direct marketing, which was if you have a catalogue, put the response number on every single page.
Right.
Because it will fundamentally increase response.
Absolutely.
Always allow people. And actually, my one suggestion to that BT finding was let's add a fax response, because we'll get another 0.5% to 1% of responses.
That's great.
But actually, those things are really important because how you frame it. In other words, to most people in finance, they would regard that as irrelevant. You either want, to most people trained in conventional economics, you either want the product or you don't. The means by which you order it should have a relatively nugatory effect on the response rate.
In fact,
it's utterly decisive.
Yeah.
And then there are other experiments like, for example, putting a smiling face with someone on the phone next to the phone number would have a larger effect on loan applications than reducing the APR interest rate.
Oh, for goodness sake. I believe that.
No. And people unaware of this stuff will spend their entire lives being completely convincing and logical to all their colleagues. They will keep their jobs, but the very logic that makes them appealing as an employee and makes them look like a safe pair of hands is, in fact, inherently damaging to the operation.
Indeed.
Now, what's interesting is that when you delve back in the early stages of any innovation, any successful innovation, you nearly always find an act of marketing genius. So James Watt invented the horsepower to sell steam engines to mine owners because he realized the only thing they were interested in is how many horses we use to drain the mines, how many horses do I no longer need to feed if I buy a steam engine? And I thought, this is bloody clever. We still use it today, the horsepower. We still use it for jet engines. The reason it's not named after a famous physicist is because it's a marketing unit. It was invented for marketing purposes, not for scientific purposes. And then the guy would go, okay, so if I buy a 25 horsepower steam engine, I don't need to feed 75 horses, because, of course, they worked in shifts.
Wow.
So it stopped the people selling steam engines burbling on about, calorific capacity of the volume of the boiler or the stroke length or the cylinder size. And they talked about the only thing that the mine owner cared about, which is, what do I say? I then delved in a bit deeper and discovered it was cleverer still, because Watt and Bolton sold steam engines as hardware as a service. The deal was, if you had an old Newcomen engine, which was much less efficient, they would come and provide you with a Watt engine for free, provided you had to do the housing and the basics, but they'd come and provide you with a Watt engine for free. What you paid them was a third of the money you saved on coal.
Wow.
Now, long before Rolls-Royce thought of charging for jet engines by hours in operation, okay, Watt and Bolton had this marketing act of genius. Now, interestingly, it aligned their incentives with the incentives of the mine owner. Most of the early Watt engines were installed in Cornwall. Why? Because Cornwall was a long way from any coal fields, and so coal was correspondingly more expensive. So it served Watt's and Bolton's interest to go and sell steam engines in Cornwall because they'd make more money. But that was where also the mine owners saved more money because the coal they were wasting in a Newcomen engine was more expensive than it would have been somewhere in South Wales or close to a coal field.
That's fascinating.
And so you realize that actually innovation, and I mean, when Drucker says innovation and marketing are the only things that add value, I go one stage further. I say they're two sides of the same coin.
I would agree.
You either work out what people want and find a clever way to make it, or you work out what you can make and find a clever way to make people want it. And the money you make is the same. The Austrians, I think, fundamentally understand all this. It's the Austrian school was incredibly favorably disposed towards marketing because it argued that the only reasonable definition of value was what someone was prepared to pay for something. And therefore, making something seem more desirable was just as much a part of value creation as manufacturing was. What I think happened in business schools because of the influence of mainstream economics was the idea was that people already knew what they wanted. The value was entirely resident in the product, and therefore all you could do was make that product less expensively. Well,
the other thing I think that is true is that we make assumptions about what will be attractive to our target customer. So I'll never forget, I was
right?
this is a long time ago now, before the internet, and I was studying Citibank Ventures for this project that was funded, and it was helping me pay my doctoral student salary. And there was this business that Citibank had, and it was a cash management system. And back in the day, if you were, say, the treasurer of British Petroleum or something, and you wanted to find out how much cash you had in the world, you had to log into 40 different logons, and you could do it, but it involved long-distance telephone lines and passcodes, and it was a pain in the neck. So what this system would do, and it was very simple, at the end of every day.
Dashboard, basically, was it?
Even better, what it would do at the end of the day was it would suck up all this information. And it only updated once a day. So by today's standards, it was bog standard, primitive, right? But it would suck up all the information. And then if you wanted to find out what your cash position was, within 24 hours, you could go look and it would give you a dashboard and all this stuff. And so I'm at the product demo. And the cast of characters are, I think it was a CFO and a treasurer of one of these big companies, call it BP, and our little project team, and a couple of observers and some young people. And so we've got this young guy who's a techie giving the demo. And he's going through and he's talking about the technical specifications and the upload speed and the download speed and the blah, 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 blah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Everybody's eyes are glazing over. And then he gets to like near the last page of the deck, right? And he says, oh, and this also gives you the ability to do downloading and local printing. And the treasurer, who'd been sitting in kind of a polite stupor, sort of wakes up. He says, wait a minute. You mean if I buy your system, I can get data that's on this mainframe thing you've got, and I can download it to my computer here in my office? And the young guy's like,
duh, yeah.
And he thinks, of course,
he thinks this is totally irrelevant. He is almost I
have to explain what downloading is to this dinosaur from the 1950s, and then the treasurer guy says, okay, well, if I get it on my computer, then I could put it in like a spreadsheet and I could analyze it. And the guy's like, yeah, of course. Treasurer closes the deck and says, thank you very much for your presentation. How fast can I get this?
Perfect.
Now, why I thought that was so...
The decisive moment was something which was a complete...
afterthought.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, if you're the CFO or treasurer of a big, giant company like that, you need a lot of stuff that the IT department has no interest in giving you. You need all these specialized little reports and tell me what the cash flow and how it's affected by the interest rate change and da-da-da-da-da. So he's just hand-to-hand combat with his IT department all day long. And now he's got a way out.
Effectively, he can bang it in Excel.
Do whatever he wants with it.
And he's now got a superpower.
And he's free. He's free from the IT department. And I love that story because it wasn't that people didn't want the other features. It wasn't that those weren't important. But the thing that made the sell was that.
So that's actually one of the most important things in marketing. I would call that an example of Kano or Kano theory. You know the thing about there are basic table stakes in a product. It has to be not shit. So if you're selling cartons of milk and 1 in 3 of the cartons leaks, you're never going to buy it again.
No.
You're out of the game. Then there are performance attributes, which is what he spent all his time talking about, which is how good the thing is at doing the thing it's supposed to do.
Right.
And then Kano, who worked with the Japanese consumer electronics industry, talks about delighters, which are things which are weirdly, in a way, peripheral to the main purpose of the product, but which insanely and supralinearly deliver on desire and happiness.
Right.
So I always joke about this, that if you grew up in the 80s, as I did, the eject mechanism on a cassette recorder, if it was done beautifully with a kind of, there was a kind of counterbalance and a bit of hydraulic damping, what a lovely action. I think there's a bit of Alan Partridge in the nice action. He says, and if it just went clack, it was fundamentally disappointing. And this is what I call the DoubleTree cookie. It's the thing which is ostensibly, it's never going to be in your key service agreement or whatever it is. No. It's never going to be but the precise reason, because it's unnecessary, it's disproportionately arresting and it's disproportionately noticeable. And so I always argue about this very interesting talking to Will Gadara, who wrote that wonderful book, Unreasonable Hospitality.
Oh, I have it. I haven't read it yet.
No, it's fantastic. That over-delivering on things that people didn't expect carries much more emotional freight than doing well things that people kind of expected in the first place. And I coined this phrase reverse benchmarking, which is that he went to the best restaurant in the world when he was the 50th best restaurant in the world. And all his staff wanted to copy various things that they'd seen. And he said, I'm not interested in doing any of that. He said, what was a bit disappointing about this experience? Now, it's the best restaurant in the world. Not much is going to be that disappointing. But they zoned in on 2 things. The beer drinkers got treated shabbily compared to the wine drinkers, as you would expect in a fancy French place. Okay. And secondly, the coffee was a bit meh. So he goes back to his own restaurant, only 2 decisions. There's a coffee sommelier and there's a beer sommelier.
Wow.
And their job is to make that next level, to use the phrase. And so beer drinkers, who are a minority in a Michelin 3-star restaurant, but suddenly you'd arrive with a list of craft beers with tasting notes and food pairing suggestions. Now, you've never had that before in your life.
No.
You'll remember that for ages after you'll remember the wine selection or some detail which... And so benchmarking, there's a great Roger L. Martin piece called Benchmarking is for Losers. That companies, what they tend to do is they benchmark against the competition and become effectively, it's Goodhart's law, you become more and more similar.
Yeah.
Every metric that becomes a target loses its value as a metric.
That's right.
And actually, you also pursue it to a meaningless extent, beyond the point of diminishing returns in many cases.
Yep.
And so it always intrigues me, because one of the things I say to small companies is, look, just develop a couple of eccentricities that your finance director won't like. It could be, NASCAR tickets are presumably quite expensive, but I suppose NASCAR's enormous, so maybe they're not that expensive. But go and develop a few behaviors that are distinctive or which are unexpected. And effectively, it's not differentiation in the pure sense, but it's distinctiveness.
It's distinctiveness,
which
absolutely.
is worthwhile in itself.
Rory Sutherland, I could talk to you all day. You've had a very illustrious career in a challenged sector of our economy, which is the whole media advertising industrial complex.
Which is, by the way, increasingly becoming like that, because the dominance of certain platforms. When I started in advertising was, if you give us some money, we'll make you more famous. It's now at risk of someone like Meta being, unless you give us some money, we will make you disappear.
Right.
Which is not the same thing.
No.
And as I said, it's not Mad Men, it's The Sopranos. It's a protection racket. It's a very, very different business. And one of the reasons I would say to clients, invest in influencer marketing is simply because no one person can completely dominate.
Right.
And therefore you need it simply for purposes of business resilience. You cannot allow your entire business to be dependent on a Google search algorithm,
Exactly.
because some guy at Google could have a whim, change some mode about search, and you suddenly find your business is half dead.
Right.
It's simply too risky.
It is very risky. So you've got a bunch of books. You've
Yep.
got how do people learn more about how to find out about your world?
So, I mean, alchemy is a good read. There are wonderful books by other people, which I'll happily recommend. I mean, by the way, the best books about advertising aren't about advertising, but any books sometimes about sort of psychology, behavior, salesmanship. Richard Shotton has written some extremely good books on this. For example, I highly recommend. I'm also a big devotee. One of the people I've learned most from is Nassim Taleb. And if you remember, the subtitle of the book, Anti-Fragile, is The Hidden Asymmetries in Everyday Life. And there are enormous number of perceptual asymmetries, which I think bedevil decision-making, quantification bias being an obvious one. I think so I'll give you a wonderful example about the fact that no decision is context-free. And the reason I'm sharing this is I think it's really, really important for everybody listening to know this. So I think this is Richard Thaler. I think he went to speak to the board of a very large company. He never names it. I've always vaguely imagined it's GE, but I'm not sure. He goes to the 8 heads of the 8 largest divisions in GE and says, I can offer you a hypothetical business decision, which 50% of the time will increase your revenue and profits next year by 50%. 20% of the time, your revenue and profits will go down by 30%. Now, obviously, in the real world, revenue and profits are not actually proportionate in that way, but it's a hypothetical. It's a thought experiment. Okay? Which of you would take those odds? Now, all of these people are good enough mathematicians to realize that those are favorable odds. Of the 8 people, 6 of them said no. And he said, well, why wouldn't you take those odds? And he said, because 30% of the time, I'd lose my job. Now then, the chief executive is sitting at the end of the table and looking absolutely askance and goes, but I want all of you to take those odds, because aggregated, we're going to end up with 50% of you making 50% more profit. That's 4 of you. And maybe 1, 2, or at worst 3 of you, but probably not 2 of you, will end up with a slightly reduced profit. We're going to be a much richer company. Suddenly occurred to me that when you push risk down an organization into smaller and smaller parts of the organization, what you actually create is, by the amplification of risk avoidance at every phase, you're creating an organization which is now operationally paranoid.
Right. And not in a good way. And
not in a good way. Now, so if you accept the fact that nearly everybody suffers from, you could call it loss aversion, but in fairness, these people are not irrational, right? Because in any business setting, you only capture a small part of the upside in the shape of promotion or a pay rise or keeping your job, whereas the downside variance is you lose your job.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's a very asymmetric incentive system.
It is.
If you create a business and you look at the effect on things like compliance, for example, or the paranoia of a data breach, where basically I cannot afford to have any mistake made in this field. This isn't a reasonable risk-reward calibration. It's just complete paranoia. Now, fundamentally, what happens between the CEO and the level of the 8 individual decision makers then gets multiplied beneath any of those 8 is another 8 people who are also basically pursuing risk aversion. So the problem you've identified, which is the inability of large organizations to innovate, is that you've effectively created organizations where nobody can fail, regardless of how favorable the odds would be.
Right. And regardless of the logic of the underlying thing, I mean,
it's not even short-termism in that case, is it? I mean, short-termism is a separate problem, obviously, in that cost-cutting is fast, but discovery is slow.
Right.
And advertising suffers from a massive bottom-of-the-funnel bias, because if you advertise close to the point of purchase, you get data back very quickly. In many cases, what these platforms are selling, isn't actually customers or brand value. They're selling defensive decision making. We can provide you with lots of data which will allow you to keep your job.
Wow.
If I'm being blunt about it, I would argue that the marketing metrics that have been, this is a wonderful piece by a guy called Adel Borki, which is on LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. The marketing metrics which most marketers are using are self-serving metrics which benefit two people, they themselves and their job security. Second, first of all, they benefit the owners of the big digital platforms because they are measures designed to enrich the big digital platforms. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so softer measures are excluded. It's of no interest to Google or Meta to promote the measurement of softer measures because it's inimical to their whole job thing, which is what we're selling you is not really value, it's measurability.
Oh, interesting. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for carving out the time.
It's a joy, anytime.
Indeed. Well, thank you, everyone.